The sleek diplomatic shuttle sliced through the teal skies of the planet Vidiian Prime, its gleaming hull reflecting the light of two suns. Inside, Max Thorne adjusted his tie, a curious blend of excitement and dread churning in his stomach. This wasn't his first diplomatic gig, but it was definitely the most critical one. And it wasn't just because of the planet's notoriously complicated trade negotiations, it was the rumors of their unique customs. As the shuttle touched down with a gentle thud, Max took a deep breath, mentally psyching himself up. "All right, Max," he muttered under his breath. "Don't screw this up. And definitely don't kiss anyone this time." The airlock hissed open, and he stepped out onto the landing platform, greeted by a gust of warm, fragrant air that smelled like lavender mixed with— was that cinnamon toast? The sky above was a stunning shade of blue-violet, dotted with clouds that looked suspiciously like cotton candy. But it was the delegation awaiting him that made Max's jaw almost hit the floor. A group of tall, impossibly graceful figures stood before him, their skin a spectrum of blue shades so vibrant it could make an artist weep. And then, she stepped forward. A female figure with skin the color of the ocean at twilight, and eyes that shimmered like the galaxy's most expensive disco ball. "Welcome to Vidiian, Maxwell Thorne," she said, her voice like someone had poured honey into a harp. "I am Christie, your liaison for this mission." Max's heart did a double-take, then tried to climb out of his throat. "Oh great," he thought. "This is gonna be awkward." He smiled back, trying to remember what Earth's manual for "don't flirt with aliens" said. "Thanks, Christie," he replied, inclining his head in the most dignified nod he could muster while internally screaming, "Don't look at her sparkly eyes. Focus." Christie's smile widened, and Max couldn't help but notice her teeth were just a little too sharp for comfort. He decided right then that compliments would be kept to an absolute minimum. "Please, let me take you to the reception," she purred. "Our leaders are eager to meet you." As Max followed her into the massive alien building that looked like someone had melted an art museum and turned it into a roller coaster, he tried to ignore the fact that everyone they passed was staring at him like he was the galaxy's hottest new snack. He'd expected some curiosity as an off-worlder, but this level of interest? It was like walking into a school dance where everyone had decided he was prom king, and also possibly dessert. They arrived at the reception hall, and if Max thought the exterior of the building was wild, the inside was like walking into a kaleidoscope on a sugar high. Every surface shimmered and shifted as light bounced off them, and Max found himself distracted by just about everything. Except, of course, Christie, who kept introducing him to an endless lineup of Vidiian officials, all with names that sounded like they'd come out of a sci-fi name generator. "This is Wrath, our Minister of Intergalactic Trade," Christie said, gesturing to a particularly tall and imposing Vidiian male. Max extended a hand, then immediately yanked it back, remembering from his briefings that handshakes were a big no-no on Vidiian. He bowed instead. "Minister, a pleasure. Looking forward to some riveting trade discussions." Wrath's eyes narrowed. "Indeed. Your timing is interesting." Max blinked. That didn't sound ominous at all, he thought, just as Christie whisked him away to the next dignitary, her smile growing sharper by the minute. As the night wore on, Max found himself increasingly distracted by her. Sure, her knowledge of Earth customs was impressive, and her laugh was contagious, but there was something else, a vibe. And not the kind you get from someone who just wants to share intergalactic shipping lanes. "You know, Christie," Max said, taking a sip of the alien wine that tasted suspiciously like a cross between champagne and spicy nachos, "I've been to quite a few planets, but I've never met a species quite as fascinating as the Vidiians." Christie's eyes sparkled, literally. "Oh, and what exactly do you find so fascinating?" Max grinned, his usual diplomatic reserve slipping faster than his good judgment. "Well, your beauty for one thing. The way you move. Your voice. I mean, are you guys trained in being captivating, or is it just genetic?" She leaned in, her breath warm against his ear. "Are you always this charming with alien women? Or am I special?" Max felt a shiver run down his spine and mentally cursed himself. "Only with the ones who could vaporize me if I say the wrong thing," he quipped, trying to keep the tone light. Christie's eyes flashed, something wild and hungry passing through them before her smile returned. "Careful, Maxwell. Such words can have consequences here." He laughed, assuming it was some cultural quirk. "A little danger never hurt anyone. Except that one time on Mars, But let's not talk about that. As the reception wound down, Max noticed a change in the air. It was subtle, but the Vidiians seemed more animated. Their movements more fluid, their gazes more intense. Christie in particular was looking at him like he was the last slice of pizza at a party. "Perhaps it's time I showed you to your quarters," she said, her voice a husky whisper. Max nodded, grateful for an excuse to escape what was quickly turning into the most bizarre diplomatic function of his career. As they walked, Max offered Christie his arm, Earth-style. She hesitated, then took it, and he swore he felt a jolt of electricity zap between them. Weird, he thought. Must be static. When they reached his room, Christie paused at the door, looking suddenly conflicted. "Maxwell, there's something important about our culture you should know, especially this time of year." Max, his brain foggy from the wine and the evening's surreal events, waved her off. "It can wait. I'm about to pass out, anyway." "Can it?" she murmured, but Max was already too tired to care. "Yep. Definitely. Let's chat tomorrow when my brain is functioning at full capacity." With a smile, he leaned in to give her a friendly Earth goodbye, a quick peck on the cheek, but at the last second she turned, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like a lightning bolt. Stunned, Max stepped back. Sorry. I didn't mean." But Christie was already backing away, her eyes wide, her breathing rapid. "Good night, Maxwell," she blurted, practically fleeing down the corridor. "Okay, that was weird," Max muttered as he stumbled into his luxurious alien quarters. The bed was massive, oddly shaped, and ridiculously comfortable, but as he collapsed onto it, his mind was buzzing with questions. What was going on with Christie? What did that minister mean about his timing? He barely had time to consider these mysteries before sleep claimed him. But just as he began drifting off, a soft chime echoed through the room. The door slid open to reveal Christie, hair down, wearing a robe so sheer it was basically wishful thinking. "Maxwell," she purred, stepping inside, "there's something you really need to know, and we may need more than a trade agreement to work this out." Max sat up, wide awake. "What do you mean?" She crossed the room like a panther on the prowl. "It's our mating season, and you, Maxwell Thorne, have chosen me as your mate." Max stared at her, eyes wide. What?" Charles sat there, blinking rapidly, trying to process everything. "Let me get this straight," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "I'm not just here for trade negotiations. I've accidentally signed up for an interplanetary marriage?" Zarek nodded solemnly. "Mating bond, yes. Marriage, no, although it's somewhat like marriage, but without the legal paperwork and more of a psychic connection. And, pheromones." Charles looked at Cor, who was sitting nearby, her piercing gaze never leaving his face. "So, you've basically, pheromone bonded me? That's great. Really. Just what every diplomat hopes for." Cor's expression softened, but her eyes glinted with a mischievous twinkle. "You didn't exactly put up much of a fight," she purred, leaning slightly toward him. "In fact, you were quite enthusiastic." Charles turned a deep shade of crimson, waving his hands defensively. "I didn't know what was happening. One minute I'm sipping weird alien wine, the next minute I'm, well, married to a space mermaid. I wasn't briefed for this. Where was this in the handbook?" Zarek cleared his throat, looking thoroughly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "To be fair, Ambassador, no amount of briefings could have prepared you for this." Charles sighed and slumped back in his chair. Okay, so I've bonded. Great. Lovely. But surely there's a way out? Like a divorce. Do you have those here? Or at least, some alien version of, it was a mistake, we were just really tired? Cor leaned in closer, a predatory smile playing on her lips. "There's no undoing the bond, Charles. You've chosen me, and I've chosen you." She paused, eyes twinkling again. "Besides, why would you want to get out of it? I thought you liked a little danger in your diplomacy." Charles gulped, remembering his unfortunate flirty comment from the night before. "Look, Cor, you're very attractive, obviously. But my planet's going to be pretty upset if I come back married to an alien without at least giving them a heads up first." Zarek nodded sympathetically. "Understandable. Though, for now, it's not exactly common knowledge. Only the Council, and the cleaning crew who saw you two leaving the reception hall, and maybe the guy who monitors the security cameras, and probably half of Azurus by now, but otherwise, it's still a relatively private matter." Charles groaned, burying his face in his hands. "I'm doomed. Earth Command is going to have my head." Kor reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Relax, Charles. You'll figure this out. Besides, it's not all bad. I've been told I'm an excellent mate. You'll be the envy of every diplomat in the galaxy." Charles shot her a side glance, noticing the sharpness in her smile again. "Yeah, I'm sure. But can we maybe cool it with the mate talk for now? I'm still digesting the fact that I've somehow gone from representing Earth to being the poster child for intergalactic romance." Zarek, clearly eager to get this conversation over with, stood abruptly. "Well, I think you both have some bonding to do." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "In the meantime, I'll smooth things over with the council and, try to prevent any more public displays." "Displays?" Charles echoed. "What do you mean, displays?" Kor winked at him. "Oh, don't worry about it. We Azurans can get a bit intense during mating season, but you'll catch on." Charles blinked. "What do you mean, intense? Because last night already felt like I ran a marathon and got electrocuted at the same time." Zarek, wisely choosing not to comment, gave a curt bow and hastily exited the room, leaving Charles alone with Kor. "Well," Charles muttered, glancing warily at Kor, "guess I'll just figure out how to explain to Earth Command that their top diplomat is now an alien mating ritual participant." Kor stood and crossed the room, her robe fluttering dramatically in the non-existent breeze. "Or," she said, her voice low and teasing, "you could stop worrying so much and focus on the advantages of our bond. I'll make sure your stay on Azurus is unforgettable." Charles felt his heart rate quicken, but he quickly shook his head. "I need a plan. A real plan. And probably a very, very long shower." Kor's smirk softened into something almost affectionate. "Take all the time you need, Ambassador. But don't take too long. Our next council meeting is in 2 hours, and you'll need to be fully prepared." Charles nodded absently, already dreading what fully prepared meant. As he made his way to the shower, he couldn't help but think about how he'd gone from respectable diplomat to what was probably the star of a space soap opera, complete with sexy aliens, confusing rituals, and life-threatening misunderstandings. And to think, he'd once believed the worst part of diplomacy was sitting through boring trade negotiations. Charles emerged from the shower feeling somewhat refreshed, though the events of the previous night still lingered like a particularly persistent hangover. The alien soap had a delightful smell, but he was pretty sure it was a subtle form of brainwashing. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. He dressed quickly in the formal attire provided for him, which seemed to be designed for someone twice his size or one of the more flamboyant Azuran dignitaries. As he struggled to adjust the alien fashion, a soft chime indicated an incoming message. Charles glanced at the communicator, an ominous message from Earth Command, of course. He grimaced, knowing that his morning was about to get even more complicated. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Kor entered with a graceful glide that made the robe she wore look like it was made of liquid moonlight. "Ready for your big debut?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "The council is eager to see you again. And trust me, they're not the only ones." Charles gave her a skeptical look. "Is there some sort of formal apology ritual I should be aware of? Because I'm about to perform the world's most awkward diplomatic dance." Kor chuckled, a musical sound that seemed to reverberate with a hidden undertone. "Oh, don't worry. Just be yourself. Or at least, try to be less flustered." As they walked through the corridors of the embassy, Charles noticed that every Azuran they passed seemed to be watching him with a mixture of curiosity and, was that hunger? He tried to ignore it, focusing on the looming task ahead. The last thing he needed was to walk into a meeting and trip over his own feet while the entire council stared at him like he was a particularly unusual delicacy. The council chamber was, as before, a marvel of alien design, an array of floating platforms and shifting walls that made Charles feel like he was walking through a particularly ambitious kaleidoscope. The Azuran dignitaries were already assembled, their vibrant blue skin shimmering under the ambient lights. They all turned their eyes toward Charles as he and Kor entered, their collective gaze making him feel like he was under a particularly intense microscope. Charles took his seat at the head of the long, gleaming table, his nerves working overtime. He cleared his throat, attempting to ignore the fact that Zarek, the imposing minister, was watching him with an air of detached amusement. "Good morning, everyone," Charles began, trying to sound as confident as possible. "I hope we can get through today's agenda without any further surprises." Zarek raised an eyebrow but remained silent. Cor stood beside Charles, her presence both reassuring and slightly unsettling. She seemed to radiate an almost tangible energy, which did nothing to help Charles's nerves. The meeting started with a flurry of discussions about trade agreements and interplanetary cooperation. Charles tried to focus, but every so often he'd catch Cor's gaze, and the memory of their intimate encounter from the previous night would make his face flush. "Ambassador Hawthorne," the lead counselor said, breaking through Charles's reverie. "Your thoughts on the proposed amendments to the trade tariffs?" Charles blinked, realizing he'd completely zoned out. Right," he stammered, trying to piece together the fragments of his focus. "The amendments? Yes. I believe they're beneficial, in theory. But we need to address the logistical concerns." There was a ripple of whispers among the council members, and Charles noticed Zarek's lips twitching in what might have been the alien equivalent of a smirk. "Perhaps," Zarek said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning, "we should take a short break. Allow Ambassador Hawthorne a moment to recalibrate." The council members murmured in agreement, and Charles felt a wave of relief mixed with unease. As the dignitaries filed out, Cor stayed behind, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice low. Charles sighed. "I'm not sure. This whole situation is a lot. I'm still trying to figure out how to explain to Earth Command that I've accidentally joined an alien mating season." Cor smiled sympathetically. "It's not as bad as you think. Azurans are passionate, but we're also fair. As long as you can navigate the social dynamics, you'll be fine." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Social dynamics? You mean the fact that I'm now a part of your mating season and everyone's looking at me like I'm a walking pheromone dispenser?" "Pretty much," Cor admitted with a grin. "But don't worry. The Council is aware of your unique situation. They'll give you a little leeway, as long as you can prove that you're still committed to the diplomatic mission." Charles ran a hand through his hair. "Oh, great. So as long as I don't screw up too badly, I'll be fine." "Exactly," Cor said, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "And remember, the bond we share can actually be quite an asset. It can help bridge gaps that traditional diplomacy can't." Charles chuckled dryly. "Yeah, if only the bond didn't come with so much baggage. And by baggage, I mean intense Azuran stares and the potential for diplomatic disaster." As the council reconvened, Charles felt a renewed sense of determination. He could handle this, he told himself. He had to. With Cor's help, he might just be able to navigate the complexities of Azuran politics, survive the mating season, and get through this diplomatic mission with his sanity intact. But as he took his seat and looked around at the expectant faces of the Azuran Council, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of an incredibly strange and wildly unpredictable adventure. And somehow, he had a sneaking suspicion that things were about to get even more complicated. Charles tried his best to look composed as the council reconvened. The floating platforms in the chamber bobbed gently, creating an effect that was either mesmerizing or nauseating, depending on your tolerance for alien architectural quirks. He noted that most of the council members seemed to be watching him with more interest than usual. Cor stood beside him, her presence almost a tangible force. She was the epitome of calm confidence, which was, of course, making Charles feel like a particularly nervous puppy caught in the middle of a ceremonial parade. The lead counselor, a dignified figure with skin the color of deep turquoise, cleared his throat. "Ambassador Hawthorne, we appreciate your patience. Now, if you would be so kind as to address the matter of the proposed trade tariffs." Charles took a deep breath and pulled up the notes he'd hastily reviewed during the break. "Of course. Let's discuss the—" His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, bizarre noise from outside the chamber, a series of high-pitched squeaks followed by what sounded like a very enthusiastic drum solo. The noise grew louder, and several of the Azurans exchanged knowing glances. Ah, the festivities have begun, Cor said, her tone light but with an edge of seriousness. Charles raised an eyebrow. Festivities? What are we celebrating? The imminent collapse of my diplomatic career. Cor's eyes sparkled with amusement. It's mating season. The noise is part of a traditional celebration. Think of it as a combination of a carnival and a very intense exercise class. It's meant to bring the community together and, well, it's hard to explain. Charles looked around, noting that the council members seemed remarkably nonchalant about the ruckus. And how exactly does this involve me? Cor's smile was almost too innocent. You're part of the celebration. As my mate, you'll be a focal point of the festivities. Charles's eyes widened. A focal point? Like a human piñata? Not quite, Cor said, stifling a laugh. More like a star attraction. You'll need to participate in some cultural activities to help show your commitment. Zarek, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. Indeed. We find that active participation helps to ease any tensions and foster goodwill. Charles sighed, resigned to his fate. All right, what's first on the agenda for this cultural immersion? Cor's eyes gleamed. Well, you're going to love this. The first activity is the traditional Glimmer Dance. It's a kind of ceremonial dance that symbolizes unity and, well, bonding. Charles stared at her. Dance? You want me to dance? Exactly, Cor said, her smile growing wider. And don't worry. It's less of a performance and more of an experience. As they entered the main hall, Charles was struck by the sheer spectacle of it all. The room was decorated with shimmering lights and vibrant streamers, and the Azurans were gathered in a wide circle, their movements rhythmic and almost hypnotic. The high-pitched squeaks were louder now, coming from a group of Azurans wearing elaborate costumes and playing a variety of bizarre instruments. Charles swallowed hard, feeling every bit the outsider. Cor guided him to the center of the circle, where a platform had been set up. The circle, where a platform had been set up. Just follow my lead, Cor instructed, taking his hand. Her touch was warm and electrifying, sending a jolt through his system. The music began, a complex blend of alien rhythms and melodic squeaks. Cor started moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost effortless. Charles attempted to mimic her movements, but his limbs felt stiff and awkward, as if he were trying to perform a ballet on a trampoline. The Azurans cheered and clapped, their enthusiasm making Charles's awkward attempts even more conspicuous. Despite his best efforts, he kept stumbling over his own feet, which only seemed to make the crowd more excited. You're doing great, Cor called out, her voice full of encouragement. Just relax and let the music guide you. Charles tried to follow her advice, but the combined pressure of the Azurans watching and his own clumsiness made it nearly impossible to relax. At one point, he tripped over his own feet and nearly fell, but Cor caught him with a swift, practiced move. Careful, she teased. We don't want you falling off the platform. Charles managed a weak smile. I'll do my best. But you're sure there's no, less public way to prove my commitment? Cor shook her head, laughing softly. Oh, trust me, this is the least of it. The real bonding happens later. Later? What do you? Before Charles could finish his question, the music transitioned to a more intense tempo, and Cor guided him through a series of complex steps that involved a lot of spinning and flailing. Charles found himself laughing despite his embarrassment, the absurdity of the situation finally breaking through his nerves. As the dance concluded, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Charles was panting, feeling a mix of relief and exhilaration. Cor gave him a reassuring smile. See, you survived. Charles nodded, trying to regain his composure. Barely. What's next? Because I've got a feeling this isn't over yet. Cor's eyes sparkled with mischief. Oh, it's far from over. Next, we have the Glimmer Feast, where you'll be sampling some of our most exotic dishes. And then, well, let's just say there will be more opportunities for you to get to know the local customs. Charles groaned, looking around at the eager faces of the Azurans. Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to it. Especially the part where I accidentally eat something that tries to eat me back. Cor laughed, the sound musical and reassuring. Don't worry. The food is safe. Mostly. And it's all part of the experience. As they made their way to the feast, Charles couldn't help but think that this diplomatic mission had quickly become the most bizarre adventure of his career. But if there was one thing he'd learned from his time on Azurus, it was that diplomacy, at least in this case, came with a side of unexpected and often uproarious surprises. Charles took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever came next. After all, if he could survive the Glimmer Dance, he could probably handle whatever else Azurus had to throw at him.